Um, my name is Sarah. I will be your host tonight. I am the education program manager here, and I just want to thank you all for joining us this evening for what is actually our final Meet the Artist of 2025. We have gathered here almost every Thursday for the last 52 weeks, and many before that, because we've been doing this for 3 years. And many of you have been here for a good portion of those, so thank you for your support. Before I introduce tonight's artist speaker, I would like to make a couple announcements because we have been busy throughout all the departments here at CPW. First off, we just announced our spring workshops and classes. You may have noticed one of the slides. So I hope many of you will consider taking advantage of these incredible instructors that we have coming to teach. There's bookmaking utilizing CPW's new digital press. There's cyanotype printing and toning, workshops on how to use Photoshop, how to print your photographs, and how to make the most of your 35 millimeter and medium format and large format cameras. There's frame building, book binding, and so much more. So please take a look because you might find something that you're interested in taking and don't even have to leave the Hudson Valley. We have two open calls out, one for the Upstate Photography Biennial, which is a juried exhibition that will feature 30 photographers based in New York State, outside of New York City, as well as our prestigious Woodstock Air program, now celebrating its 27th year. So please spread the word and consider applying yourself if those fit you. Now, without further ado, let's get to tonight's artist presentation. Pete Penn was born in the Khao I Dong refugee camp on the border of Cambodia and Thailand in 1982. His family were resettled as refugees in Stockton, California in the 1980s. Penn's work explores themes of memory, migration, and intergenerational trauma among the Cambodian American community across the United States and among his own family in the US and Cambodia. A high school dropout, Penn is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, where he did honors and was awarded the Louis and Charles Outstanding Honors Thesis Award, the International Center for Photography, and the University of Hartford's MFA in Photography. He received fellowships and grants from the Magnum Foundation and Open Society Foundation's Photography Project, among others, and his work has been featured in the New York Times, Time Magazine, NPR, and Vice. Penn has exhibited at the International Center of Photography, Smith College, the University of Michigan Museum of Art, the Asian Art Museum, and the Library of Congress. His series on the Cambodian diaspora is in the permanent collection of the Library of Congress and is currently featured in the inaugural exhibition, Collecting Memories at the Treasures Gallery at the library. He lives in the Hudson Valley in a pre-Civil War farmhouse with his wife, writer Jane Rose Porter, their children, and a house full of animals. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Hello, good evening. Thank you. First, I wanted to thank CPW, the staff, Nicole and Sarah, and also especially Nadia, who's here in the audience, who first introduced me, brought me here to the space and said, hey, you should do an artist talk. So I'm just really, really grateful to be here. I've really admired CPW from a distance, but haven't really been that active or involved until pretty recently. And I've done a workshop here. I participated in one of the photo book clubs. So I'm just grateful for the community and the space. I'm going to talk about two bodies of work, Migrations of Memory, and that was in This Is Now, all kind of related to my own personal biography and my kind of attempt to use photography as a means of excavation into the past. This is a photograph that I don't know who took this photograph and I don't know how, but that's my mother and father and me in a transitional kind of leaving a transitional refugee camp in the Philippines on our way to being resettled in California. And I was born directly in the aftermath of the genocide in Cambodia in the Khao Dang refugee camp, which at its height was about 150,000 people, all waiting to be resettled to the West. So I've don't have any, lived experience in terms of what happened in Cambodia, but I've very much so lived through it through my parents' struggles in the community in which I was resettled in Stockton, California. So I like to always start with this thing. My name is Pete, and I was born Pete. My father was learning English in the refugee camp and named me Pete. Because he was reading a story about a boy named Pete and knowing that we were coming to America, wanted to give me an American name. And it wasn't short for Peter. He didn't even know what Peter was. He just named me Pete. And then when we arrived, my mother thought it was odd that I had this name, and she changed my name on the spot to Sopal, but she spelled it Sophorl. So my legal American name, what's on my passport or my driver's license, is Sopal, which has always been pronounced as Sophorl. And my Cambodian name is Pete, meaning my entire family in Cambodia, my grandmother, my late grandmother, my parents all knew me as Pete. So that's kind of part of the complexity of like this dual identity that I have as a Cambodian and an American, this hyphenated identity that I carry. So first I'm going to talk about this work, Migrations of Memory, which I spent about nearly 8 years working. It was kind of one of my first kind of journeys into photography. I first started photographing or was found photography when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. And I had no idea. I'd never seen photography. And I walked into a retrospective of Richard Avedon's work. And then the 50th anniversary of Robert Frank's The Americans. And it was such an amazing, fantastic experience just to be able to see kind of what we can do with photography. And it put me on this journey. I left graduate school and I moved to the East Coast and then I started to pursue photography. And it really started, this is my grandmother who recently passed away. She's the matriarch of the family. And she was the person who kind of kept the family together and alive during the genocide. I took this portrait of her in like a makeshift studio that I set up in her garage in Stockton, California. And I interviewed her for the first time in my life about my family's experiences during the killing fields. And I found through that this photograph of my mother, so that's my aunts, uncles, and my mother. My mother is second to the left. And this photograph was buried when the Khmer Rouge was arriving in the village. And my uncle went back in the 90s on a return trip to Cambodia and retrieved it. So it kind of opened up this idea of a photography as a vessel for memory and family stories for me. And it pushed me on this journey. So I attempted to recreate this in different contexts in terms of that photograph, that experience I have with my grandmother. This is my father. I'll get back to him later on in the talk. But he was, at this point, he was living in Cambodia, but he came back to the States for a short period, and I photographed him. And this is my godfather in the Philippines who taught my father English. My dad is on the left. And then I did this again with other families. We're kind of thinking critically about this intergenerational process of finding and discovering objects of memory, similar to what I had experienced with my own grandmother. So I set up these makeshift studios in different homes, and I had multiple, within the space of a family home, going through documents and ephemera. And making a portrait and then scanning these documents. This is a refugee identification card. It's kind of what a lot of Cambodians like myself who grew up kind of in the shadow of this experience kind of saw, like on the wall not knowing exactly what it was or what it meant. And in the refugee camp, this was used both to identify you, obviously, to create a sense of personhood in the Western legal sense, but then also as a card for rations to get your food and to establish yourself as a person that can get resettled in the West. So again, like these documents, they just existed. A lot of people framed them, photographed them, framed them, put them on the wall, and children like myself would encounter them on a regular basis, but not really fully understand what it meant. These are other, again, like, people had obviously access to cameras during time of the refugee camps was really rare, but, some people did have cameras and sold pictures. And this was one of them. So when I first started photographing, so I did these I call them diptychs. But then I also was really kind of through my own, through finding Robert Frank and my kind of infatuation then with a lot of Magnum photographers and Kudelka, and was trying to do more reportage. So I photographed in Cambodian communities across the states, in the Bronx, Philadelphia, Lowell, Massachusetts, and California, Stockton, California, and in Long Beach, California, kind of going through trying to kind of tell this broader story about the Cambodian American experience, which I thought was then, wasn't a story that was told. And also for me personally, it was an attempt for me to try to really fully understand kind of this complexity of this experience. This is in the Bronx, and the person I had spent time with, and after making this photograph, had told me that when she had arrived, was resettled in the Bronx. You can imagine being a Cambodian refugee and all of a sudden being thrown into the middle of the Bronx. Was afraid to go out of the door, and spent the first week inside without stepping out, and would come out little by little and kind of map the neighborhood. And then, talking about like, how do we photograph trauma? How do we photograph the past? How do we photograph something that's so internal? And so these were like visual strategies that I was trying to work through in an attempt to kind of show the past and the present. This is a Cambodian temple in the Bronx. And it's in a very Puerto Rican, Dominican neighborhood. For me, there's this idea of creating communal space, sacred spaces that belong to the community in this really foreign land. This is in the Bronx also. This is a civics education center where a lot of Cambodians learned, the Declaration of Independence and things such as that. Yeah. Spent a lot of time also in Philadelphia. This is a Cambodian family in Philadelphia, and Angkor Wat, which is kind of centered. There's a photograph of Angkor Wat there in the middle, and that's kind of a really big source of Cambodian identity. And we're told that you have to visit Angkor Wat at least once in your life. So this family I thought was amazing. They took out a photograph that they had made in the States and fixed it as a collage on a photograph of Angkor Wat. And then thinking, about the generational component of this, of children who kind of grow up like myself in the shadow of this. This is also in the Bronx, in that temple that I showed earlier. And so I grew up in a house where my family spoke to me in English, but they amongst each other spoke Khmer. So I didn't actually have the language. I had an ear for it, I understood Khmer, but I wasn't able to speak it. And that's a very common thing with my generation of Cambodian Americans. And this image for me just kind of encapsulates that generational separation between the youth and the elders. And obviously this is a literal physical wall between. This is an altar to a deceased grandfather. So when I was making these images, I was a fellow at the Magnum Foundation, and so I was very, very influenced by reportage, documentary photography, and I was just trying to mimic that style, that was a big, big influence. And it shows, I look at these pictures now and it's very different from the way that I approach photography. Yeah, so this is in Philadelphia during I found this gentleman during the New Year, the Cambodian New Year, which is like the biggest, holiest festival of month, or I'm sorry, a couple of weeks in the Cambodian calendar. And this tattoo kind of really, really strongly encapsulates like this complicated story. Because so on one hand, it's a Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and the other is the skyline of Philadelphia. And I asked him, after taking this picture, like, what does this mean to you? And he told me that for him, the killing fields didn't stop in Philadelphia. And that's something that I wrestled with growing up myself in Stockton and in Long Beach, California in the 90s with lots of gang violence, street killings. Yeah, so, it's that the irony with this is that the children of survivors were also killing each other on the streets in the 90s, in the early 2000s. This is a gentleman who, this is in Long Beach, California, and he was shot 5 times after his prom. And he was at a Denny's parking lot with a group of people, and there was a drive-by shooting, and they just sprayed the crowd, and he got hit 5 times. And again, like, the culprits were probably other Cambodians, right, who identified them as or who believed that they were gang members just by default of the way that they looked. This is also in Long Beach. There's a canal there in the back. You could probably see in the background. This is around the corner from a friend's house who was unfortunately whose life was taken away in the early 2000s, kind of randomly by a gang member who killed him and his cousin, kind of really point blank. And yeah, it's just like what do you do with that? I've spent a lot of time trying to really understand like just the senselessness of that. And it was important to me to try to tell that story. Yeah. And also, the bigger story about American identity, right? So here's a child in the Bronx, and very much so American, as much as I am American too, playing video games and obsessed with the Yankees. This is a classroom in Philadelphia, the Cambodian Association of Greater Philadelphia, where they're teaching both Cambodian dance, which is like a very sacred art form that has a history of over thousands of years, where the dancers were all during the killing fields were all eliminated. So nearly the entire discipline, the entire form was almost erased. The Khmer Rouge had targeted all artists and intellectuals, in addition to the bourgeoisie. So if you wore glasses, you were targeted by the Khmer Rouge. If you're an artist, you're also targeted. And what kept the form, the ballet alive was in the refugee camps. The survivors in the camps taught children and the youth how to dance, and that's what kept it alive. Prior to that, ballet, Khmer ballet, is a sacred art form, in the sense of the feeling of that, or that the dancers are angels from heaven, and they perform for the king and the queen. They perform in the royal court. So it wasn't something that was taught or brought to regular people, but in refugee camps, it was spread out. And also, of course, Khmer. So there, kids are learning Khmer. I learned how to read and write when I was at Berkeley, not at home. Because Berkeley happened to was like a Title VII institution as a depository of language, and offered Khmer. So I learned, like as an undergraduate. Food is something that's really, that I go back to again and again in the context of, so during the killing fields, during the genocide, people starved to death, and there wasn't enough food. People stole when they could. But, like a basic scene like this is in Philadelphia, is full of meaning in that context, right? So my approach was, again, like a reportage, kind of fly on the wall photography, kind of, being in these spaces, being invited into these spaces, and making documentary images. This is a wedding in the Bronx, and I was so moved by this idea of this rebuilding of these cultural spaces. So, here's a couple who are getting married, and there's, for me, the what they're like on that the fabric, as a kind of the physicality of that cultural, the cultural space, recreated in the Bronx, was beautiful. This is a memorial to a gentleman who unfortunately was killed by the police in Philadelphia. And this is my hometown in Stockton, where I grew up. And there's a really large temple in Stockton. And I'm moved by, these acts of rebuilding. So again, like, this is, for me, it's all about this process of rebuilding these spaces. Yeah, same thing here. This was in 2013, there was a really large festival, a Season of Cambodia festival in New York. And it brought about 100 visual artists from Cambodia to New York. And they also brought the World Dance Troupe, which was the actual dance troupe, the ballet troupe, that performed for the royal family and whatnot, back to New York. And it was the first time they had come since before the killing fields itself. This is a dance troupe in Lowell, not the World Dance Troupe, but these are young Cambodian Americans who are learning the form of the art. And this is the actual Royal Ballet performing at BAM in Brooklyn during that festival itself. And again, this was the first performance post-genocide, post-1970s. This is the Water Festival in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is one of the biggest kind of gatherings of Cambodians. It's a festival that's done in Cambodia also, but here in the States, it's a pretty big deal. It's like thousands and thousands of people show up. And this is a gentleman. He's not. I mean, he was a teenager then. He's an adult now, though. But he's actually fishing, and he told me this is the way his father fished when he first arrived to America. And he's holding a line, fishing without a fishing rod in the Bronx. And finally, that's my grandfather, right before his passing. So I had, these, I first started photographing, again, the reportage style, documentary style, but I was really unsatisfied with what I was doing. I wanted more from photography, less interested in kind of the formal and aesthetics, but more on what photography can do. So I played around with these installations. This is my first ever iteration. This was again in the Bronx. This is a karaoke night at a home in the Bronx, and elders, they would do karaoke and get drunk every like, it was a big thing. It was like a big gathering of people. And I did this where I brought in photographs, invited, both the elders, but then also their children to come. And I put these photographs on the wall, and I was a bit shocked, or not necessarily shocked, but surprised at the reception, because I was naive to believe that photography is this universal language. Of course, it is not. And people said, why did you photograph this way? Why is this head obscured? Why are these fingers or arms here and there? And it kind of really made me kind of really think critically about how, what we can do with photography, the language being not obviously universal, but more so like how I can unpack the process of image making to get at really what I wanted to do, which is this intergenerational conversation about one's history, one's family, and also for young people like myself, this sense of connection to your family story. This is another installation. This was at the Montefiore, it's like a mental health clinic in the Bronx. And it was one of the first clinics that worked directly with Cambodian refugees in the 80s and early 90s. Cambodians were the first kind of population where there was large studies on trauma. And this clinic worked directly with survivors. So again, this was an opportunity to put, this was a thing I did with this organization called Infoco. Amazing organization. I don't know if they're still active. But again, just simply putting photographs on the wall. And then for me, learning or coming out of this, understanding that wasn't sufficient, it wasn't enough. So this is my first kind of mock-up of trying to think critically about an installation, about how to use photographs in a way to generate conversations outside of just the image itself. And this is a mock-up of a physical kind of, so there are two boards. One is of Cambodia, and the other one on the other side you can't see. So it's a map of Cambodia and a map of the US. And they're 6 feet by 6 feet, and they're 6 feet apart. And this is the actual final kind of how it came together. But I put this in a series of workshops in different Cambodian communities in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Stockton, and in Long Beach, California. And invited, working with community partners, community associations in those areas, with the youth groups, inviting young children of survivors, people like myself, to come participate and to reflect on their stories. I made these booklets that kind of helped guide people through the process of interviewing family members. And similar to kind of my own personal experience with my grandmother, looking for ephemera, documents, photographs that can connect them to the story. So this is so these booklets were open-ended. There's a brief basic timeline that I created. and open-ended in a sense of participation, where people were could kind of give as much as they wanted or not at all. So some books were completely blank. People just sat in and observed, and that was totally fine. And some were a lot more detailed, like this, and that also was fine. Some were just reflections and writings. But then also people went out and found ephemera and photographs similar to, again, to what I did. And they made those photographs on these Polaroids, and then we strung them along as kind of a visualization of migration and memory. So participatory in the sense of not only just photographing and participating in the workshop, but also in generating the installation itself. So this was put up in every site. When I first put it up, there's nothing, there were no contributions, and then it was iterative. So over time, it built up. When I broke it down and brought it to the next site, I would put up the previous contributions, and then we use that as a source of reflection. And then people added to that. So again, it traveled from Philadelphia, Chicago, Stockton, and Long Beach, California. These are just some of the Polaroids there. People were invited again to write they could write whatever they wanted, right, to reflect on. Some again were devoid of any writing. Some didn't take pictures at all. And again, like people shared like this sense of like, wow, like these are pictures that I had on my wall, or that I may have glanced at or so, but not really fully understood what they meant. And so the participants were everyone from people like myself, who I consider myself the 1.5 generation. So I was born in the camps, but was raised here. I came here as a baby. So some people my age to teenagers. And it's like what can we do with photography, right? And for me, it's just like it's this vessel, right? Like the images become a vessel of memory, but then also the sense of like of having not only a connection to your story, but also recognizing how important your story is. And in the context of refugees and the big community of Cambodians, your story isn't that special if everyone, your neighbors and everyone that has lived through this experience. But of course, the reality of it is that it's exceptional, that these are incredible stories of survival. This one was really cool because this was in Stockton. This was a bag that this person had found. And inside the bag was a family tree that they had never seen, that was handwritten by their grandfather, and a bunch of travel documents. So with the family tree, again, like a hand-drawn family tree, by, you can imagine, again, like entire families were wiped out in Cambodia. So, like the need to create that, to make that, and to bring that with you, to have it as a document, it's really compelling, really powerful. This is in Khao Dang. Again, everyone who resettled in the States had to go through Khao Dang, and we call it a bamboo city because at its peak it was 150,000 people, and now it's an empty forest. So you can imagine an entire city of refugees who had gone through what they had gone through, and their time in the camps was also a source of a lot of trauma. This is like, so we would end every iteration, with the community showing. So in family and community members would come and look at the installation itself. And again, it's about connecting to your story, but also about understanding or like the significance of that story. So this takes me to my current, well, what I've been working on for the past 5 or so years, 5, 6 years. And so this is my dad. This is actually the original frame. This wasn't broken. Like I didn't actually do this purposely to make this photograph. It's just the way that it was. And my dad was someone who really struggled with his mental health. And he raised me as a single father, which is very rare in Cambodian in the Cambodian community. Divorce is not very common. But he really struggled, and he really kind of leaned heavily on me as a kid, really to, just for, and my wife is here. When after I got married, I knew, of course, that I wanted to become a father, and I knew that to become a father, I needed to work through this, and I needed to also. So my father left when I was 13, and moved back to Cambodia, and we had been estranged for about 20 years. I saw him for a brief period when I photographed him in that early photograph I showed, but I had no connection to him. He left and he was gone, and that void was something that I didn't really fully appreciate or understand until I started photographing in my late 20s. So this is Toni Morrison's Beloved. Where I was before I came here, that place is real. It's never going away. Even if the whole farm, every tree and grass blade of it dies, the picture is still there. And what's more, if you go there, you who was never there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It'll be there for you, waiting for you. And this is Morrison's idea of a rememory, right? So the memory being not only personal, but it's communal and it's spatial. It's a thing that you can encounter physically by physically being at a place. You could bump into it. And that was something that really moved me. So this is me. This is in the Khao Dang, actually. So this is a clearing in the jungle. And I went back to Cambodia to find my father. And to photograph with a large camera, as opposed to my previous way of photographing with a small camera, which was fundamentally different. But again, using a big camera fundamentally shifted my approach. But it's about inhabiting the physicality of the space. So I went back to Cambodia to not only find my dad, but then to map out all these different sites of my family story. Through stories that were told to me by my mother, execution sites, labor camps, ancestral homes, and of course the refugee camp. So I'm going to, I spent maybe about the last year and a half kind of working on an edit of this, and I'm going to quickly just go through these images, and then I'm going to go back and talk about them, if that's okay. These images were made in Cambodia and also in my home in upstate New York, in the Hudson Valley with my family. These are also stills from the movie, the 1984 film, The Killing Fields, and I'll talk about that later. This is the last image there. Let me go back. Pardon me. So as I mentioned, or as I I'm interested in photography as excavation, right? In sense of the camera as a tool, as a shovel to dig up the past. And I felt I've spent like so much time photographing in the Cambodian community, and excavating kind of, communal trauma. But I didn't actually have the opportunity to go and kind of map out my own family story. So kind of taking like that installation that I showed a moment ago, but actually kind of embodying it physically, going to Cambodia and making these images. And one of the big things that I've come to grips with, come to understand in the last several years of making this work is this idea of you have a shovel and you keep on digging, and then you find yourself in this hole. And what does that mean in terms of your own identity? So for me, I felt that my professional and my personal identity was so wrapped up in this trauma, in the context of both my process as a photographer, but then also me personally as as a husband and at this point a future father. So I really felt the deep need, to do this work in the sense of working through that past, but then most importantly to not wallow, to not live in that space, and to find a means of transformation. So I felt like I needed, to go and make these images and find my father, but then I also needed to reflect on what that meant for me as a father and as a husband. So this is on the border of Cambodia and Thailand, in Western Cambodia, in Pai Lin. And I open it as a sense of mythology. My mother had this dream when when she was pregnant with me, when she learned that she was pregnant with me, of standing on this mountain of dirt and being in the field of hundreds of other women digging with their bare hands, and they were digging for a diamond. And then my mother looks down and she sees the diamond at the base of her feet. And then subsequently she learned that she was pregnant with me. So this was my attempt, to go to that space and to kind of to make that image, but then to think about, what that meant. Think of, the context of, again, my mother was 17 when she had me. She was put in a labor camp when she was 10, I believe. And, so I can't even imagine. I mean, I had a rough, 17, when I was 17 was rough, but for my mother, I cannot imagine. So, I like this image right on the border. I jumped on a motorcycle, 3-hour trip to make it here right before sunset, set up my 4.5 camera, took one picture, got dark, and headed right back. And this was it. This is a cave. This is a killing cave. And would have been where my grandfather, whom I had never met, know very little about, would have been killed, at least according to my family members. And you can see there's a statue of Buddha on the bottom. And this is one of those moments where, I'm standing there with the 4.5 camera, and if you are familiar with the view camera, you go behind a dark cloth, and everything is upside down. So the frame is upside down, and the wind was rustling, and you hear footsteps, and I'm physically embodying that space and thinking about in the time span of the universe, that. I mean, these images are made, as photographers know, 250th of a second or so, right, for the exposures, right? But in time span of the universe, I'm standing right there with my grandfather, and I'm imagining, what he must have thought and the sense of falling down into this cave. On a side note, too, when I was doing this, there was a tour of in Cambodia, many other places of mass violence, they've become tourist sites. So there was a someone came up to me, and of course I could just hear them in the background. I didn't see them because I'm behind my dark cloth. And they're like, "Oh, nice camera." I'm like, "Well, you have no idea. You have no idea why I'm here, what I'm trying to do." This is my wife giving birth to our son at home. Our son was born during the pandemic in 2020. And we decided to have a home birth. And it was an act of courage that I had never witnessed in terms of the actual birth itself, strength and courage. And when my son was born, I was afraid to hold him in my arms, because I had been told that like your interior self is expressed to this child when you hold your newborn, and I was hesitant and anxious, in the sense of not wanting to transmit my traumas and my past onto him. This is after the birth of my daughter. She's 2 now, turning 3. My son is 5. This is placenta, her placenta. I'm sorry. And this is, there's actually in the crowd, there's a group of people here who I worked with at Clock Estate, and a friend who's here gifted my son and my daughter and I chrysalises, monochrysalises. And we photographed this together. My son and I photographed this together in our backyard. And it was kind of a moment of transformation for me because it gave me, I had put these pictures away for several years without looking at them. And then upon taking this picture, I had the wherewithal to kind of go back to these photographs and to make an edit. This is my dad. So my dad was really, as I mentioned, was very, really struggled and was very, very fatalistic and openly suicidal. And he was open with me with that as a kid. So his impending death was something growing up, it was just always on the back of my mind. So when I go to Cambodia and I found my dad, it was as if he was in a time capsule of his own suffering. And when I first saw him, he said he was so glad to see me, but that he was going to pass away soon. And again, it flooded me with all these really difficult emotions and the sense of helplessness that I had as a kid. But I was able to make these portraits with him. He had passed shortly after this. So my dad passed, I made after that trip and shortly after my son was born. And when he passed, I didn't really know what to do with these photographs. I kind of put them aside. And again, it wasn't until after I took this photograph and another one like this that kind of crystallized for me this need to go back to these pictures. This was on the mantle of my father's mantle in Cambodia, and that's my 4th grade school portrait there in the middle. And this is just the way it was. It was just set. It was it was folded over like that, and it spoke so much to me about our story. My dad is he's second, no, third from or kind of in the center on the top image there. This is my mother's ancestral home in Battambang. And this is an uprooted tree that's directly in front of her house. The home that she was raised in still stands, and it was taken over by the Khmer Rouge when they took over the village, and it turned into a field hospital. So people in the village believed it was haunted, and they abandoned it for decades. No one lived in there. Um, and again, yeah, just it's yeah. It's my daughter after being born, and this was my dad shortly before his passing. So this, there's a film you may be familiar with, Killing Fields. It came out in 1984. It was it won an Academy Award. It was shot at probably the time that I was in the camps themselves. This is the final scene. I had watched this movie when I was a kid, of course, and it was the first time I had visually encountered like what happened in Cambodia. So it gave me kind of it illustrated for me and put pictures in my mind of my family's experience. This is the refugee camp, Khao Dang, actually, and the film ends on this scene as a it's this place for hope. These were field hospitals in the camp. But this was the ending of the movie, and I just remember watching that and just feeling like, wow, like that's like you have this like this like this veil, I guess, or this, like it gave me a sense of like this is where I came from without fully understanding what that meant. This is the other picture that I'd mentioned that I took that kind of crystallized for me, that kind of pushed me to go back to this work and to finish it. So one of the stories that I was told is that my family had bartered about $10,000 of jewelry for a single chicken to survive, right? To save themselves from starvation. And the Khmer Rouge eliminated all money. They blew up all the banks. And yeah, so it's like, well, how much is a chicken worth to you, right? And so it's one of those things that I think about every once in a while, of course, when I'm having chicken. But this is this is upstate, and this was a chicken slaughter. But I needed to make this image, and I needed to, yeah. My dad was a Christian, and he raised me up as a Christian also. And I kind of rejected. I'm agnostic now, but this is what it represents for me. He was obsessed with the story of Job, if you know the story of Job. And my dad has really severe psoriasis, and he identified with Job. But I had always believed, even as a kid, like so let me take a step back. When I was in college, I encountered Nietzsche for the first time, and there's a quote, I can only believe in a God that can dance, and I very much so. I can't believe in a God of suffering. It's my son and my wife apple picking. So this is on my last day in Cambodia. I went to Kamokcham, which is where my dad is. That was about 2 hours from the capital, and to say goodbye. And he was on the phone, and I was like, "Oh, who are you talking to?" He's like, "Oh, I'm talking to my gravediggers." I was like, "Wait, what?" Like, he was so obsessed with his mortality that he had his grave dug before he passed. So I jumped on a bike. It was a 2 hour drive. I had 2 sheets of film left, and this is not the best photograph, but it was what I was able to make. Yeah. This is in Ban Bang. This is one of the largest work projects by the Khmer Rouge. This is a reservoir that was hand dug by through forced labor. And my family on my mother's side would have been involved in this. Lots. I mean, I don't remember off the top of my head the amount of people that perished through the forced labor, but I mean it's massive. And this is a recreation of that in the film The Killing Fields. my wife's garden. This is so when my mother, so the Khmer Rouge has separated all, they, not only did they destroy money and blow up the banks and executed intellectuals and artists, they also eliminate the family as a unit. So your family belonged to Angkor, not your mother, not your father or so. So they separated the children from the, and my mother as a kid in her camp decided in the middle of the night that she needed to go find her mother. So like a 10, 11-year-old. So I went, you can see there's a little, it's hard to see through this, but there's a canal, a ditch there on the bottom of the frame, and that was dug by my family. And my mother had used that as a guide to go find her mother, but also to find her way back. So this was shot at 2 a.m. in the middle of a full moon. But also, again, like inhabiting the physicality of that experience and thinking, about my mother's experience. This is a killing pond in Banbang. My son's first bath. Again, this is from the film The Killing Fields. And it's, so it's like one of the central like preoccupations of mine in this work is to think critically about how the past manifests itself in the present. And through that, is, and of course in my day-to-day and my relations with my family. This is a cave. That cave that of my grandfather. It's just inside the cave itself. There's an additional. So there's another hole you can't see in here. Another spot where they for children. And these are so this was an early pairing that I'd made in terms of again finding. Sequence, finding images that speak to each other about the past and, of course, the present. My father's medicine bin in Cambodia. And this is in Stockton, this 8-mile road where my dad and I took a lot of drives during the sunset. And during one of these drives was when he told me he was going to Cambodia. So I told myself I had to go and make this image. So this is that same monarch freshly emerged straight out of the chrysalis within minutes of it coming out. His wings are still wet and it's still spreading itself out. My sister, whom I met for the first time when I went, so my father remarried, had another family, and it's very common for returnees. And I met her for the first time, and this like identification of someone who really, can understand my dad and the insaneness of his story. My brother also, whom I met for the first time also. This is a replica of Angkor Wat that's incomplete, unfinished, done by a refugee in Khao Dang in the middle of the jungle. And it still stands as there, just kind of overgrown with foliage. And as you may know, in terms of the, our America's involvement in Cambodia during that period in the shadow of the Vietnam War, is we bombed the shit out of Cambodia, right? And this is, of course, covered in the movie. My father told me that, so B-52s were not, you couldn't see them, right? They flew so high, you couldn't see them. Villagers were terrified of the ordnance. And again, like I'm interested in this generational kind of transfer of trauma, but then also, I've been very in the past 4 or 5 years been really interested in the emerging research on epigenetics, on the inheritance of trauma. But then more so for me, kind of the sense that, so we know that there are different pathways for inheriting trauma, communal and cultural, but epigenetics talks about a very specific, in terms of actual physical inheritance of. But for me, what was amazing or kind of eye-opening for that is that if your genes can be affected by your parents' lives and their experiences, well, then your genes also can have the opposite effect of transformation, right? Of finding, a way out of that. This is a company I found in Missouri that does DNA portraits. So this is my DNA. And again, talking about like the past and the present, one of the triggers that I've come to really understand is I'm triggered around food. So my son, this is when he was a couple of years old, would throw tantrums about food, and I would have these. I would just be so triggered that I have to walk out of the space. And I didn't really fully understand why until fairly recently, honestly. Both through making this work, but then also, of years of therapy. My kids' dollhouse. So I just passed that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yep. I'd raised chickens, wanting to photograph them for this project, kind of thinking about that story that I mentioned about of my family bartering $10,000 worth of jewelry for a single chicken. Yeah. And this is one of the more amazing kind of experiences I had with my wife, who was there with me when we were traveling through Cambodia. We were looking for the site of where my aunt would have last been before she was killed. And we found this. This is a temple in Battambang Bang. And we were told that this was probably where she was last at. And of course, there's like these group. It's a school, and there were a group of kids playing soccer. And I just thought how poignant and beautiful that was. And this is so that mountain is where my mother's labor camp was at, and also the same site of the cave that I showed earlier. So she again was a child put into this labor camp, but I stumbled on this field of flowers that someone had planted at the base of this mountain, and she charged people 25 cents to come and take pictures. And these teenagers were just there taking photographs, and just saw how beautiful that moment was. As again, as a site of transformation. And in the last picture, my daughter. Right after a meltdown, she had a hand, foot, and mouth disease, and then she just kind of fell asleep right after. But again, like I'm like the goal or the purpose of this work, and I may not have fully articulated that, isn't to live in this space, but to transform and to find a way to make meaning of this, but then also to transform my own personal identity as a father and a husband, through the materiality of his work, and to reorient myself as someone that I've always identified as as a child of survivors, to a father. And so that's been a transformative experience in making this work. I've made a book dummy of this, and the way that I framed it when I was working on it, very much so, is the sense of taking the history that I carry, the traumas that I carry, and expunging it out of my body into the physicality of this work and the materiality of making this. And it's obviously a work in progress in terms of that process, but it's been genuinely transformative for me. So thank you so much. Yeah.
10 minutes for questions. If anyone has anything they want to ask, Pete? Thank you, Pete.
Yeah. Yes.
First of all, thank you. It's quite remarkable to see how you've taken a medium that was turned against the people of Cambodia during the regime, and you embodied it into life in the future. I was struck by the installation you did with the workshop, right? And I was wondering, for the people who participated in that, if at the end of the workshop, like they either got their Polaroids back, or the book was made, or some kind of receptacle for all of the people who participated, who are in the refugee diaspora, to feel this connection and this bond.
Yeah. So the Polaroids themselves, the originals weren't, because they were re-put back in. So we scanned them. I brought in an actual physical scanner on site, and we scanned and made prints of those. We also scanned the booklets too. Some booklets we kept, those who wanted to share, but people got their booklets back. Yeah. But I guess, the big takeaway from that for me, and I would hope, the participants, was this shared collective conversation that was happening, that was instigated, through this process of making pictures. Yeah. Yes.
You don't want to say thank you. I met you in the workshop a few weeks back.
Yes.
That was a good experience in itself. But to share this piece of your art and the history, I got to tell you, it really touched here, because in a way I'm a horse father, and I'm just learning about all my family background, gathering whatever evidence I can, and it's beautiful to see that.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. I do believe, these stories are extreme, may sound or are, but the reality of it is that it's not really that, given the context of the world that we live in. And the reality is that a lot of us carry, in some way or another, similar circumstances. So, there's a degree of where the universality of this, I think, transcends this experience, right? Both in the sense of migration, of forced migration, of course, mass violence, but also just inheriting a history that you're trying to understand.
I think that it's so powerful that I speak for myself, maybe others, that take some time to process. And so it's not the lack of appreciation, but the power of appreciation.
Thank you. And I do apologize. It was, a little heavy, obviously, very much so, and I guess if you if you know me, I can't help, I carry that with me, and I'm very open about, but yeah, but so I just am grateful for the opportunity, grateful that you're here to listen. So, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So much and so beautiful. I'm a emerging writer and I'm trying to about my language. And I similarly went on a project in Chinese about food and I documented Korea. So I went to China and Korea and it was site return
Okay.
visits.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering how you're contending with your body and your emotion.
Right.
I remember when I
Yeah.
was there, I could only get like 2 photos.
Right.
A piece, just
Right.
because I was so
Right.
there and bodily. So I'm just wondering, what's your process?
Yeah, I mean that's a really, really insightful point. I think so. One, I was shooting with a large format camera, and if you're familiar with that process, it's a lot of equipment. There's many things that are involved to make a single photograph, right? So having to do that in, like, for example, the cave photograph, right? So I have a backpack, it's filled with equipment and the tripod, and I have to set everything up. And it's 100 degrees and 100% humidity. And I'm going through that whole process. And if you make one mistake in terms of doing something off, like putting the photo's gone and you don't even know it, you won't know until you develop the film. So that kind of the material, the physicality of that process was cathartic, right? But then also just kind of also gave me some distance from that space. But also both gave me some distance, but also allowed me to inhabit it also in a more visceral way. And then not being able to see the photographs. So in context of photographing Cambodia, I had to actually carry the film with me across the border, like walk across the border to Thailand, and then take an 8-hour bus to Bangkok to develop the film. So I didn't see this stuff until months, even some to like a year later or so. So that space also between making a photograph and seeing it and editing it and then making the sequence gave me a lot of time, so that was critical. But yeah, I think it would have been very different for me if I approached this with a small camera.
Not a family members, especially considering the shared trauma. Did you find it difficult? Did you have to work more at your relationship with before you photographing these your intimate relations? The wedding, or even like the karaoke nights.
Right.
Yes, do you find things different in the way that you might have to put
It's genuinely like it was a shock to me how open people were to allowing me into such private spaces. And part of it was kind of this like I was, yeah, I feel so grateful that, that people allowed me into their homes in such a very, very private space. These homes in Philadelphia and the Bronx, so they're small. It's not a lot of light. It's dark. There's things here and there and stuff. But people are so generous, and part of it for me was I always worked with young people, so I would work both with the associations, the Cambodian associations, but I will always gravitate towards people kind of like myself, who were kind of grappling with the same questions, and they were kind of, they were the ones that let me in, that allowed me to come in and to make photographs, and through that, was kind of like snowballing, meeting other people and whatnot. Though, but again, like I don't know if I can do that kind of photography anymore. I know that I can't. I don't have it in me to do that kind of work. I have pretty significant critiques of that process. I think my relationship to photography has fundamentally transformed over the course of my career. And but again, at the same time, I'm those are such intimate spaces, and I'm just, again, I just feel so grateful. But again, my there's a fundamental imbalance of power right? As a practitioner, right? And even within my own family, right? Like my father, of course, he was very open to me photographing him, but how could he fully comprehend or understand what it was I was doing? You know, like he couldn't. There's no way. Yeah. I think we're good. Great. Well, thank you all so much. I know there might be some people watching on the stream, so thank you for tuning in. Yeah.